Okay, so there should be a picture of Frozen up there, but I have this sort of weird idea that my life should be like a Disney cartoon, and I don't know if you guys think so too. But I grew up with Disney musicals, and they always turned out well, so I wanted my life to be like a Disney character. And as I've gotten older, I realized that every single Disney movie is exactly the same. And so, follow me, just think of Mulan, Lion King, Tarzan, any movie. If you guys watch High School Musical, if you're that generation, and even Frozen, but that's not, I should have a picture of it. So follow me. Every family is sort of broken in some way, right? You know, so oftentimes it's an orphan, or your parents are disabled, and so the protagonist elicits the sympathies of the audience, right? And you always feel sorry for orphans and stuff. And then the orphan grows up and is a misfit in their society, right? So Elsa in Frozen freezes her sister. Mulan tries to be a man when she's a boy. So there's always that misfit, I don't fit in. And instantly everybody relates to that because they feel like, gee, I'm a misfit too. I don't really belong, right? Because that person's a misfit, they go through an identity crisis. And so they start singing. And you sing to the water, you sing to ice, you sing to pools and so you have that going on where there's songs about who am I, you know, and then there's a big conflict within their community because they don't fit, and then they're rivals with another. You have the big conflict, you have the wacky sidekick all the time, right? But eventually, the hero finds themselves, finds their role in society, saves the community, and then, you know, becomes princess or gets married and lives happily ever after, or Mulan has the emperor bow down to her. So you got that story, right? So every single character is exactly the same. All they do to make it multicultural is to add stereotypes. So for Mulan, they throw a great wall and eating rice. For Elsa and Frozen, they have dukes and castles, right? For Tarzan, they have jungle scenes, you know, it's really, and now that you think about it, you go, crap, now I've ruined every Disney movie. But it works, because everybody identifies with the Disney character. And so next thing. Because that character gets the best of both worlds. That character gets to feel special for who they are, right? They got some gift, so they get the best of having an identity, of feeling special about themselves. But they also get this great sense of belonging because they fit in. They eventually fit in. So it's both worlds. They have a uniqueness and a belonging that everybody wants, right? That's sort of our quest. I want to be special. I want to stand out in some ways, but I also want to fit in. I want to belong. And Disney heroes get the best of both worlds. And that's why I want to be a Disney character, right? I think you guys do too, right? In your hearts, you want to stand out in some way. God made me special, right? But at the same time, also, I want a community. I want to feel loved. I want to feel like I fit in. I want to feel hip and cool, right? All right, next slide. The problem, though, is a lot of us don't get the best of both worlds, but we actually get the worst of both worlds. And this is my story, and this is my tension. I've always wanted to be special. I've always wanted to have some talent, to stand out in some way, right? To be able to play basketball, or to be able to sing, but I'm just normal, right? And I want to fit in, but as a minority in the United States, and as, I don't know, look at me, you know, I don't fully fit in a lot of ways. And so that's my dilemma. Okay, next slide, please. And so what a lot of people do, and this is what I did, is that a lot of people look for their ethnic identity to make them special, right? So we'll retrace our roots to find at least some cultural pride that we could be proud of. And so let me read you a little excerpt about my sort of ethnic identity quest in order to feel special and also to try to belong, to be a Disney character. So this is this is part of my story. My people have no name for themselves. The term Hakka literally means the guest families. We've moved so often that we don't know where we originally started. As a guest of other Chinese for millennia, we have no identity save our subordination to others. I scarcely knew what it meant to be Hakka while growing up. My father proudly relayed to me that the Hakka were rebels, nomads, and pirates. I tried to picture myself in these occupations, but none of these jobs seemed very marketable in San Francisco in the 1980s. So when I had a free afternoon while traveling in Hong Kong one year, I went in search for my roots in the Qinhuan district. There I hoped to find clues about my Hakka heritage. Perhaps they might have some cool artistic or musical styles. Maybe I could find records of my ancestors and trace my lineage for centuries. I longed to locate a metaphorical home where I could hang my hat. Or better yet, maybe I could hang my princely crown. I could be an ancestor of a Hakka king for all I knew. So once a sleeping fishing village that was a homogeneous ethnic enclave, Qinhuan had replaced all traces of previous Hakka presence with towering residential blocks and neon shopping malls. Despite this urban sprawl, Qinhuan hosted one remaining Hakka remnant. Okay, next slide. The Samton Uk Museum, a Hakka walled village with 12 original houses. With much anticipation, I approached the blank whitewashed walls of the museum. They were windowless and without ornamentation, built as a defense from pirates of the Pearl Delta. I stepped through the wooden gates. Trembling, my own forebears may have once trod the hallowed halls of Samton Uk. I took a step into my past, but soon discovered only hollow echoes. The hallway was unadorned of art or decoration, so I expected to enter more interesting exhibits in other spaces. Yet the inner rooms were quite barren too. The living room had a wood bench and a small shrine, but no specific lattice work, no exquisite pottery, not even decorative flooring. I became increasingly dismayed as the bedrooms and a closet of typical Hakka clothing revealed further the simplicity of my people. Shirts and pants were made of black cloth without any embroidery or coloring. Only the hats were distinctive for their curtain fringes used to keep out the sun. I was getting disappointed about the Hakka culture. I expected a little more from a minority group that had been distinct for over 22 centuries. Then I came upon the kitchen. Ah, now I will see how we make our mark, I thought to myself. Chinese live to eat, so Hakka cuisine must have some fine delicacies. At this interactive museum exhibit, woks with bamboo steamers sat atop brick stoves. I lifted the steamer lid and readied myself to discover some scrumptious-looking Hakka treat. Okay, next one. This is what I found. Chicken crab dumplings. The signature Hakka food was named chicken crab dumplings. I thought that must have been one of the placards that lost something in translation from Chinese to English. Earlier on my trip, we had come across a sign with a picture of a slithering reptile. It alerted, "Warning, snacks may bite." And so we quickly scanned around for dangerous Rice Krispie treats. But as I further read the exhibit, I was disappointed to learn that the dish was labeled correctly. The Hakka chicken crab dumplings were tea cakes made of glutinous rice and small black seeds. The dumplings did look like chicken crab. To me, that's the apex of Hakka civilization. I'm Hakka, a guest person. My identity derives from a simple agrarian people who live in the hillsides that no one wanted, dressed in black, and wear hats with curtains, and our food looks like crap. So that's the start. I'm not special. I wanted to find my ethnic roots and be proud of my heritage, but it turns out my people don't have anything distinctive about them. They're actually, and as I researched more, not only do they lack distinction, they were actually despised. So what do you do when you're not special in America? That doesn't make sense. Okay, next slide. Because in America, everybody's special, right? In the United States, we have this model of identity development, and that we are supposed to individuate, that as you grow up, you have clear boundaries, you become different from your parents, and you become a distinct, autonomous person, right? You make your own decisions, you have your own boundaries. Next. And the Christian world, especially evangelicals, they buy into this notion that we should be self-actualized individuals. So we're very individualistic. So Rick Warren says, you're most effective when you use your spiritual gifts and abilities in the areas of your heart's desire in a way that expresses your personality experiences. The better fit, the more successful you'll be. So this whole notion in American Christianity that not only are you special, but God made you special, and you got to find God's special will for your life. So there's all this pressure. You got to find out your spiritual gifts. You got to find out your abilities. You got to figure out your heart's desire. So there's all this self-examination, right? Who am I? You're like a Disney character looking in a mirror. You got to find out who your personality is. You got to figure out your experiences. And then if you can combine them all, then you'll be successful. Because that's what Americans want to be. They want to be successful. They want to know themselves. They want to be self-actualized, right? So your Christian calling is to be special and to meet that special calling, right? And then you'll be successful in God's eyes and the church's eyes. But I didn't know that. I didn't know who I was. I couldn't find it, right? So there's all this pressure. I got this pressure to be special, and then Christianity further burdens you because you have all this self-reflection. You're trying to pray and ask people, can you help me discern my calling? And if you can't figure it out, what does that mean? Okay, next slide. So, go on. Some of the pitfalls of this individualistic identity is that, for me, this is what happened to me, because I'm actually sixth generation American. I become sort of self-obsessed and narcissistic, thinking about who am I? How do I fit in? What are my giftings? What should I do with my life? And you just become really sort of self-absorbed, trying to figure out yourself. And then if you can't figure out who you are, then you feel like sort of self-pitying. I'm not special. You feel like entitled. I should have a calling. I should be special, but I'm not. Something's wrong, right? God's cheated me. Because you feel entitled. That's how it's supposed to be. And then what's worse is that people always told you if you work hard enough, you can be whatever you want to be. Right? Every high school graduation speech is just dream your dreams and you can be whatever you want to be. But then you feel like, God, I must have all this potential, but I'm not realizing it, right? Do you guys identify with this? Are you guys really with me? It sucks. So that's how I am. I feel like very burdened by this notion of being special. Okay. Ralph Ellison wrote, some people are your relatives, but others are your ancestors. And you choose the ones you want to have as your ancestors. You create yourself out of those values. So, I decided, and because I'm doing this memoir, to go back and look at what my ancestors did and see what values I could choose from them, what I could learn from my family. And so I'll tell you a little bit of my family story, saying, maybe I'm not special, but maybe I could learn something and still draw from my ancestors. So I'll tell you some ancestry stories. Okay, next slide. Next slide. No, keep on clicking. So my great-grandmother and my great-great-grandfather first came from China in 1868. So the Hakka got pushed down and pushed down and pushed down to the edge of China. So eventually, after the Hakka-Kunti Wars, war against with Cantonese, we actually got put on a reservation. And then after that, a lot of the Hakka left. So a lot of them are in Southeast Asia, a lot are in Hawaii, and then my family went to California, 1868, right? So there they thrived because right then, when they arrived there was no one there. And because Russians and Americans had killed all the otters for the fur trade, the abalone population just boomed, right? So Chinese get there and they go, look at all this abalone, and they go, this is gold. And all they would do is just scoop up all the abalone. So they're doing well. And there's all this, I have all these stories about my great-grandmother making a living very close to the land, reusing redwood. But then ethnic competition came. So Italian fishermen came, and then Portuguese whalers came, and they actually rammed the Chinese boats. And there's one story where the the way the Chinese fish is they would drum their boats to scare the fish into the nets, but that would scare away the whales. And so the whalers didn't like the Chinese, and so they would ram the Chinese boats and cut Chinese nets. And so there's one case where the Chinese actually sued the Portuguese whalers for damages, but then it got thrown in court because they were Chinese and their testimony didn't count. So then they hid a white witness under the nets, and the white witness saw the Portuguese whalers ram the Chinese boats, and they went to court, but that was thrown out because they said the white witness had business interests. So he was sort of had a conflict of interest. So that was all in the New York Times. The Italians came and they started fishing, so the Chinese ended up fishing at night. And they would hold lanterns, and they would have squid just sort of swim up to the lanterns. So they would just scoop up squid by the glow of lanterns. It was very romantic. But it stunk, it stank, because they would dry the squid. So if you ever eat dried squid, it tastes good, but then your hands smell and everybody looks at you. So this was one of the few places where Chinese women actually immigrated to. So it was actually a village. It was half female and half male. Everywhere else in California, you had a bachelor society because there wasn't any immigration of women. Racial hatred increased during the 1880s. I don't know if you guys know about the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was the first racial group to be excluded by race to immigrate. In Monterey County, they did a referendum to see, should we allow Chinese to immigrate? And only one person out of the entire county said, yes, let's allow Chinese. The other 2,000 voters wanted to bar Chinese immigration. So there's a lot of racial hatred. Yes. The animosity increased as the Chinese began to seek up the place with more squid. So in 1906, there was the earthquake in San Francisco, and a lot of Chinese left San Francisco and moved down to Monterey because they had women there. And so the locals, resentment of the Chinese boiled over because their squid smelled, and now there were more Chinese moving in. So there was a mysterious fire in 1906 that burned down the village. And my great-grandmother had met my great-grandfather there. They married. They established the largest fishing business, or one of the largest shipping businesses in Monterey. And their whole home got burned down. And so, next. So not only did they, so after the fire, the landlord, who was Leland Stanford Jr. of Stanford University, he actually bulldozed the village and put a fence so that the Chinese couldn't return. So he effectively evicted the tenants. And nobody knows why the fire started, but suspicions are that Stanford and his company started the fire to scare rid of the Chinese. My great-grandparents filed a class action lawsuit, just like the Oak Park story, I don't know if you saw today, about us fighting for our homes, but they lost. So what happened was that, I'll go back. What happened was that my great-grandparents had to move back to San Francisco, Chinatown, probably the only safe place. By that time, they had become blind with diabetes, and they died destitute and poor. And it would take our family 3 generations before we were able to climb out of poverty. Okay, so that's the first story. Okay, next story. The little girl on the far right is my mom. She was born in Oakland, and then my grandfather decided he wanted to be in movies. So you don't think about this but he did. So he moved his family down to LA in the 1920s. And, but they couldn't move to, they were like Beverly Hillbillies. You remember that movie? Where these hillbillies pack up everything and move to LA with swimming pools, movie stars? My mom was a Cantonese hillbilly. She's actually another linguistic group that are, Cantonese are sort of hillbilly, but they're even more hillbilly than the Cantonese. So they moved down to LA, and they actually had to live in South Central LA because of racial segregation, right? And it turns out my grandfather actually turned out to be a drug dealer in South Central. So like 100 years before me. It's like, wow. And he was actually imprisoned for dealing. And my uncle said he kept a gun above the water toilet because he used to have water tanks above the toilet. And so they have all these stories of drug dealing in South Central LA. He's like, oh gee. Dude, you don't think of Chinese guys back in the 1920s dealing, but that's my uncle, my grandfather. He passes away, and my grandmother gets tuberculosis, right? So back then they get quarantined. So what happens when you don't have any parents? What happens to the kids? And so they have 4 kids, my mom and her 3 siblings. What happens to kids? They're orphans, right? And so usually what happens to orphans? Yeah, they get put in orphanages. But back then, they didn't have any Chinese orphanages, and because of segregation, they couldn't go to any white orphanages, so they were threatened to be separated. So what my mom did was she went on the down low, and she pretended to have a relative take care of them, and she collected welfare, but they had no relative. So she was 15 years old at the time. She rented her own apartment, and they were all just sort of living like little rats, I guess, eating candy all the time, living on their own for 6 months. So African Americans couldn't take advantage of the GI Bill, even though they were vets. They couldn't buy homes in the suburbs, whereas whites could. So whites at middle class status, African Americans stay in low income areas. That's why today African Americans whites have 20 times the assets of black people. It's not because necessarily they're smarter or more hardworking. It's all because of this one policy. So my family and me, I'm a product of race, of both racial discrimination that kept my family in poverty, but also racial privilege. And I think a lot of us have to recognize it's not we're all totally victims or we're all totally exploiters. I'm both. I'm a product of both discrimination and privilege. So let me sort of sum up all my family stories that are in. So you heard those 3 family stories, and this is what I read about them. My family stories aren't unique or special. In fact, my forebears suffered from the same onerous policies and disparate treatment which other Chinese in the U.S. received. My great-grandmother was forcibly removed from her home, purged just as 300 other Chinese communities were driven out in the 19th century. Officially excluded from this country, my grandfather had to give up his name and become a paper son. Likewise, so many Chinese claim to be born in the U.S. like him that every Chinese woman in California before 1906 needed to have given birth to 600 babies. So a lot of Chinese are undocumented aliens. My mother, stricken by tuberculosis, had to be quarantined and watch her siblings be separated into different foster homes. My father's siblings also were taken from their parents for the same reason. Catching this disease by living in crowded, squalid conditions, Chinese were 3 times more likely to die from tuberculosis than whites in San Francisco. I actually had tuberculosis as a kid too, so that's what I get for being Chinese. Treated disparately as a group, we suffered from similar racial consequences: being purged, segregated, stereotyped, impoverished, struck ill. In resistance, the Chinese fought back together. My ancestors defended their livelihoods and homes. They filed lawsuits and directly tore down fences, keeping them out. Going around unjust laws, they assumed different identities and maintained their own secret residences. They established their own culture of ring games and basketball tournaments, of Chinese schools and midnight snacking. Those were other stories. When Chinese did get ahead, we were beneficiaries of collective efforts. Longshoremen fought for union rights that got my father a decent wage. African Americans seeking integration opened up jobs for my grandmother and uncles. Veterans defending our country obtained special entitlements that boosted my father out of poverty. I am not that unique, but an object of racial Orientalism like other Chinese. I'm not very special, just an heir to class privilege that made me who I am. Rather than trying to see myself as a self-made individual and a star of my own Disney movie, I've come to recognize the impacts of race and class. Not only do I acknowledge them, but I choose to be a person of color and in solidarity with the poor. I choose to be Hakka. Next. Okay, so it goes on. I claim to be Chinese Hakka because that's how I can draw close to Jesus, his compassion, and his ways. It's not the only identity I embrace, nor it's necessarily the best one to become like Jesus. Living as a guest, nonetheless, provides helpful alternatives to American individualistic thinking. Jesus himself was like a Haka. Biblical history recounts a narrative of a loose confederation of people, the Hebrews, who were lowly desert nomads, exiled refugees, and colonized minorities. Traveling from Judah to Egypt, his family had no choice about where they would live as persecuted refugees. Jesus did not reside in his ancestral city, Bethlehem, but had no homeland like the Haka. His family lived in Galilee, a region known for violence and banditry. Residents from his backwater village in the hills were mocked as evil, as evidenced by Nathanael's question, "Can any good come from Nazareth?" Once Jesus began his ministry, he was a guest person. The Messiah wandered as a migrant worker from town to town with no place to rest his head. He did not have citizenship in Rome, although he had to pay taxes to the empire. To those who encountered him, he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Jesus lived the life of a Haka. If I am to understand him, if I am to love him, I need to be a guest person myself. Further, if I'm to follow in his footsteps in ministry, I should find solidarity with the Haka and others similarly marginalized. Such a solidarity enables us to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. Jesus identified with the poor and suffering, being moved with compassion for them. He didn't love them from afar, but left the riches of heaven in order to sympathize with human weaknesses and our trials here on earth. Surprisingly, Jesus wants to have fellowship with sinners such as I. Calling us his friends, he joined with traitors, tax collectors, shameful prostitutes, and unclean lepers throughout his ministry. He died so that we can be reconciled to God and to each other across racial and class lines. I too want the joy of that kind of fellowship. Solidarity with the Haka and the poor gift me with a close belonging, joint purpose, and communal peace that God intended for his people. Finally, learning the ways of the Haka shows how to live lightly here on the earth. The Hebrews in Babylon also faced the temptation to conform to the land of their exile. To protect them, God sent them prophets who warned them to remember who they were and where they were from. They were to be simply guests in that empire, separate in their ways and beliefs. Similarly, we need to be holy through our simplicity and generosity, just as Daniel sought to be undefiled by Nebuchadnezzar's powers and riches. We should be set apart by our solidarity with the poor and concern for the common good, just as Nehemiah aimed as he rebuilt Jerusalem's walls. Paul and Peter wrote to remind the Christians in the Roman Empire of their resident alien status. Paul wrote to the Philippians how he counted every earthly accomplishment as losses, especially in light of its citizenship in heaven. Peter too instructed the diasporic church in the provinces of Asia Minor to live out their status as foreigners and exiles to the world. To lead holy lives, he reminded us to see ourselves as a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. I may not be special, but I'm blessed to be part of God's special possession. As I reclaim my Haka roots and learn the values of being a guest, then perhaps I can know how to journey like Jesus. So that's the end of the first chapter. And next slide. So I go on in the book and take this guest metaphor and Chinese concepts and apply them to this idea of ministry. And if you guys want to hear about it, I have other things. So, I've been doing urban ministry, and I found that I did urban ministry a lot differently than what white evangelical books suggest how you should do it. And so I have this whole approach about doing ministry as a guest. Because Jesus sent his disciples out as guests of people of peace. So I have this whole approach of identifying with people of peace and being reliant on them. You saw the Oak Park story and how we fought for justice. And I see justice in a very Asian way, not an American way. And I could talk to you more about that. I go on to raise my family in our neighborhood. And so these aren't our kids, but I talk about my own marriage and how I raised my own kid and our foster daughters using Asian love languages. Have you guys heard of the 5 love languages? They're supposed to be universal. They're not. There's 2 other Asian love languages which are probably more universal. Food and sacrifice, right? And if you think about how God loves us through the Eucharist, and through sacrament. That's how he loves us. So I think they're much more meaningful. Yeah, I don't know what Gary Chapman writes about, but I sure that would be fun. So I talked about how I raised my family in the hood, and especially amidst pressures for education and safety, how we negotiate that. And then finally, I talk about my sense of vocation and our church, New Hope Covenant. So if you want to hear any of those things, I have more. But that's sort of the gist of the book. And so I'm open for questions or suggestions. That was boring. So thank you for listening.